Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is simple. Cut through the noise, get past those headlines, and really uncover what actually happened. You get bombarded with information constantly, but how often do you feel like you get the full story? The one that explains why something really matters, or maybe reveals a win nobody even reported on. Well, today we're digging into a stack of really fascinating insights from some recent events, stories that honestly were often twisted or just completely overlooked by the usual narratives. We're going to unpack how accountability sometimes happens in really surprising ways, how civil liberties get defended, and how finding those crucial hidden details can totally reshape how you understand power.
Yeah, and what's so interesting, I think, is how often the most significant stuff happens, out of the spotlight. It might be in a courtroom or maybe behind closed doors in diplomacy. We're going to look at specific cases where just sheer persistence, strategic thinking, and frankly, a commitment to principle made a real tangible difference, even when the public story looked completely different.
Exactly. That's what we're here for. So we're going from, believe it or not, a makeshift detention camp deep in the Florida Everglades and the legal challenge it sparked, all the way to a super high-stakes diplomatic showdown in Washington, and even a pretty bizarre security slip-up in Alaska. These are the stories that really show you why digging just a little bit deeper is always worth it. Okay, let's start with this first one. It involves a place that sounds, almost like something out of a movie, a detention facility someone nicknamed Alligator Alcatraz. But this was absolutely real. And the way the story got reported, it completely missed the point of a pretty major legal victory. So what exactly was this Alligator Alcatraz in reality?
Yeah, Alligator Alcatraz. It certainly wasn't a typical building, not a purpose-built prison or anything like that. You really have to picture a series of huge tents, just massive tents put up quickly in this sort of low-lying, swampy bit of Collier County, Florida. And logistically, it had an airstrip nearby over in Miami-Dade for bringing detainees in and out. So it was remote, but connected in that way.
Okay, tents in a swamp. What were the conditions like inside?
Pretty stark. Think razor wire around the whole thing, guards, obviously. And inside, hundreds of immigrants and asylum seekers just housed in these temporary, really barely adequate shelters. But the core problem, the really critical issue, was that these detainees were essentially cut off from lawyers, and crucially cut off from immigration judges.
Wow.
Yeah. People were describing it as like a mashup between Guantanamo Bay and a fire festival campsite. And that fire festival bit sounds maybe a little lighthearted, but it kind of captures the chaotic, temporary, thrown together nature of it. But the stakes here were infinitely higher. It was a fundamental denial of basic due process, constitutional rights. It was almost as if the idea was to make people just disappear into the Everglades where nobody could find them, A huge challenge to basic rights.
And that's where the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, stepped in, right? What was the basis of their lawsuit against this whole setup?
Exactly. The ACLU filed their suit on July 15th. And their core arguments, honestly, were incredibly straightforward, rooted in basic legal principles. They argued detainees have a right to see their lawyers, lawyers have a right to see their clients, and immigration judges need to be able to actually hear these cases accessibly. These aren't small points. They're fundamental aspects of due process in our legal system.
It speaks pretty clear cut. How did the administration respond?
Well, instead of tackling those rights issues head on, the administration at the time took a different approach. They tried to delay things, get bogged down in procedural fights. Specifically, they focused heavily on the venue, meaning, where should the case legally be heard? Miami, Orlando, somewhere else. And while all these procedural arguments were happening, you had real people stuck in those tents without the legal help or the judicial oversight they were supposed to have.
So it became a legal battle over procedure while people were in limbo.
Mm-hmm.
How did it actually play out in court? And what was this undisclosed win you mentioned earlier?
Right. So the case went before Judge Raul Ruiz, who was an appointee of the president at the time. And if you look at his ruling, it's long, like 47 pages, and it's very clear his main focus was intensely procedural. He spent a lot of time on, is this the right courthouse? Issues of standing, like, do the plaintiffs even have the right to bring this case? And exactly whether it should be in Miami or Orlando. But here's the key thing. The detail that most of the news coverage just completely missed. Before Judge Ruiz even issued that full ruling, the administration basically blinked.
Okay. What did they do?
They quietly, without any big announcement, opened up access to the Chrome Detention Center, which is over in Miami-Dade. Now, Chrome is a proper facility. It actually has immigration courtrooms. It has dedicated spaces for lawyers to meet with clients.
So just the act of filing the lawsuit, the pressure it created, forced this change even before the judge ruled.
It really is. That opening of Chrome. It was a direct, undeniable result of the pressure from the ACLU lawsuit. But then, when the news finally came out about the judge's ruling, the headlines often painted a totally different picture. You saw things like split decision in court, or judge sends immigration case to Orlando, sometimes even judge dismisses lawsuit over alligator Alcatraz.
So the headlines made it sound like a loss, or at best, a mixed result for the ACLU.
Exactly. And what's so striking is how badly the public narrative missed the actual outcome. The truth is, the ACLU won. They achieved a major victory. Not because the judge handed down some final sweeping ruling saying you win on all points, but because the lawsuit itself forced a massive policy change. It's a great illustration of this concept of the prevailing party in a broader sense, where, just starting the legal action, even if the case technically becomes moot because the policy changed, that's what caused the good outcome.
That really challenges the usual idea of winning means a judge banging a gavel in your favor.
It absolutely does. In cases like this, the legal pressure itself, just filing and pursuing the lawsuit, that can be the knockout blow. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often do we miss these quieter but incredibly impactful victories because the headlines are misleading or just incomplete? They happen behind the scenes, but the effect on people's lives is huge.
Yeah, I can definitely see how getting bogged down in the venue fight could distract from the real issues.
Yeah.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, it feels like a way rights could get chipped away,
Yeah.
Not all at once, but bit by bit.
You've hit on something really important there. The facility, geographically, it did kind of straddle two counties. The tents were in Collier, but the runway and the transport hub were in Miami-Dade. So, okay, the venue argument wasn't totally out of left field legally, but Judge Ruiz spent a lot of his ruling on it. He even seemed frustrated with the ACLU, saying they were shifting facts. But the facts weren't shifting because the ACLU was being tricky. The situation on the ground was shifting. It was a live, fast-moving humanitarian situation. Government practices changed week by week. The ACLU had to keep updating the court.
So instead of tackling the rights issue directly, the judge kicked part of the case down the road on procedure.
Pretty much. So what does that mean for you, the listener?
It shows how fundamental rights can be diminished, not always with one big, obvious attack, but through these incremental steps, this erosion, often hidden behind procedural arguments and technicalities.
And it really highlights just how crucial these kinds of lawsuits are, doesn't it? Absolutely critical. If the ACLU hadn't filed this case, it's very likely those detainees at Alligator Alcatraz would still be without proper access to lawyers or judges. Lawsuits like this one, and there are literally hundreds of them across the country on various issues. They are vital. They act as a check, keeping government systems honest, protecting democracy right there on the ground, way beyond just the big, flashy Supreme Court cases that get all the attention. These lower court cases, these persistent legal fights, they're really like the first responders of our democratic system, forcing accountability when maybe other ways fail.
And you mentioned earlier there was an environmental angle to this too, something that also got overlooked.
Yes, and a really significant one. The Alligator Alcatraz facility was built right in the middle of the Everglades ecosystem, which is incredibly fragile. There's actually a whole separate lawsuit still ongoing, challenging the environmental damage caused by putting such a big facility in that sensitive area. The Everglades are crucial for South Florida's water supply. People call them the kidneys of South Florida. That's how important they are for filtering water.
Okay, so another layer of impact.
Right, and what's really interesting is the contrast in judges. Another judge, Judge Williams, who handled the environmental challenge, had zero problem asserting jurisdiction and actually halting parts of the construction because of those environmental concerns.
Yeah.
It just highlights a very different judicial approach, a willingness to cut through the procedural stuff and deal directly with the real-world impact of what was happening. A real contrast to Judge Ruiz's initial focus on procedure in the ACLU case.
All right, our next story takes us from that detention camp and the legal maneuvering around it into a courtroom. A courtroom where a sitting member of Congress found herself targeted by the Justice Department. And this case brings up some really serious questions about potential political double standards and how prosecutions happen. Let's get into what some people are calling the MacGyver case.
Right. The congresswoman involved here is Representative LaMonica MacGyver. She's a Democrat, represents a district in New Jersey. The incident happened back in May. Congresswoman MacGyver, along with two other members of Congress, was doing an oversight visit at Delaney Hall, that's an immigration detention facility, also in New Jersey, and doing oversight visits. That's a standard, essential, constitutionally protected duty for lawmakers. checking on conditions, ensuring proper governance in federal facilities.
Okay, so a routine oversight visit. What went wrong?
Well, during the visit, things escalated. Federal agents tried to arrest the mayor of Newark, Ross Baraka, who was also there at the facility. This attempt led to basically a scuffle. Chaos ensued. And after that, the Justice Department filed charges against both Mayor Baraka and Congresswoman MacGyver.
And the U.S. attorney in charge in New Jersey at that point, Alina Habba, her background was a bit, say, unusual for that job.
Well, that's putting it mildly, yeah. The U.S. attorney for New Jersey then was Alina Habba, and she was, quite notably, one of the former president's personal lawyers. She moved quickly, filed trespassing charges against Mayor Baraka, and then charges against Congresswoman MacGyver. But the case against the mayor, it fell apart almost instantly. Prosecutors themselves basically had to admit charges wouldn't stick.
And the judge wasn't impressed?
Not at all. A federal judge apparently absolutely lit into Habba's office, made it crystal clear, saying that prosecutors have one and only client, and that client is justice. Not the president, not a political party, justice. It was a really strong rebuke against what looked like politically motivated prosecution.
Okay, so Baraka's case dissolved, but Congresswoman MacGyver's fight went on, and her team is going for this selective and vindictive prosecution motion, which you said is tough to win.
Extremely tough, yeah. She's fighting back hard with motions to dismiss. The big one is this claim of selective and vindictive prosecution. It's a high bar legally because you have to show the prosecution wasn't just wrong, but that it was motivated by an improper reason, like politics, and that other people in similar situations, but maybe without the same political label, weren't prosecuted. But what makes her argument really powerful, kind of jaw-dropping actually, is the direct comparison her lawyers are making.
A comparison to what?
To the hundreds of people involved in the January 6th events at the U.S. Capitol. Because remarkably, both Congresswoman MacGyver and many of the January 6th defendants were charged under the exact same federal law, 18 U.S.C. 111.
Okay, wait. Same statute. Can you just remind us what 18 U.S.C. 111 covers?
Sure. It's a federal law that basically makes it illegal to assault, resist, or impede federal officers or employees while they're doing their official duties. It's a serious charge meant to protect federal personnel. So MacGyver's argument boils down to, look how this serious law is being applied so differently.
Right, so lay out that contrast for us. January 6th versus Delaney Hall under this same law.
Okay, think about January 6th. You had rioters who stormed the Capitol building. They broke through police lines, pushed past barricades. They physically attacked about 140 officers. Officers got serious injuries, concussions, broken bones, someone lost fingers. And tragically, 5 deaths were linked to the events of that day. Yet, at the time, you had certain political figures defending some of those rioters, calling their prosecutions a grave national injustice. Some even got pardons later.
Okay, and compare that to Delaney Hall.
Now, Delaney Hall. You have Congresswoman MacGyver. She's there doing her constitutionally protected job oversight. She gets caught up in a chaotic moment when federal agents try to arrest the mayor. But critically, according to reports, no officers were hurt. So the question her team is hammering home is, how can people involved in a violent insurrection who attack police get pardons and sympathy, while an elected official doing her job gets dragged into federal court under the very same law? To many observers, that looks like a textbook example of selective prosecution.
And you mentioned video evidence.
Yeah, apparently the video evidence from Delaney Hall, when you put it side by side with the footage from January 6th, some sources say it looks almost laughable in comparison. Rioters smashing windows versus the scuffle at Delaney Hall. It really underscores the perceived disparity.
This whole situation just screams concerns about the impartiality of the justice system.
It really does. I mean, when you have people in federal prosecutor roles, jobs that absolutely demand impartiality, and they're openly talking about political goals or seem to be targeting people from specific political parties, it inevitably raises serious questions about the justice system being potentially weaponized. And Alina Habba herself, after taking office, made some pretty overtly political statements. She apparently talked on a right-wing podcast about wanting to turn New Jersey red. She announced investigations into other Democrats on national TV.
Not exactly subtle.
No. And that kind of thing really erodes public trust. It makes people worry if equal justice under the law is actually happening. If you connect this to the bigger picture of how government should work, It's a serious concern. Plus, there was this whole issue at the time with some Trump-era U.S. attorneys, folks who hadn't even been confirmed by the Senate, still holding these powerful positions. That added another layer of questions about legitimacy and accountability.
So even though these selective prosecution motions are usually long shots, MacGyver might actually have a stronger case than usual.
She seems to be in a pretty unique position, yeah. Usually it's hard to find clear examples of others not being prosecuted for similar things. But MacGyver has hundreds of real-world examples, or the January 6 cases, showing wildly different treatment for what appears to be far worse conduct under the same statute. And then there's the video evidence contrast we talked about. So this case, it really goes beyond just one congresswoman. It becomes a kind of litmus test, doesn't it, about whether justice in America is truly applied impartially, or if politics can tip the scales.
Okay, let's shift gears now. We're moving from these domestic legal fights into the very complex world of international diplomacy. And sometimes the biggest wins aren't about achieving something spectacular, but about quietly preventing something bad from happening. Our next deep dive looks at a really high-stakes situation where European leaders basically had to step in and, well, manage a potentially tricky encounter between the former president and Ukraine's President Zelensky.
Yeah, this is a fascinating look behind the curtain of diplomacy. So the context here is crucial. Ukraine, as we know, has been fighting this brutal, grinding war with Russia for nearly 3 years now, just immense sacrifice. And throughout this, they've been heavily reliant on Western support weapons, money, diplomatic backing. The U.S. role in this has been absolutely critical, a real heavy hitter. However, the former president had repeatedly signaled a kind of unreliability when it came to Ukraine, sometimes sounding cozy with Putin, openly talking about making big peace deals.
Deals that sounded like appeasement to some?
Exactly. Deals that worried many allies might involve, throwing Ukraine under the bus, maybe forcing concessions. So when a meeting was actually set up between Trump and Zelensky, alarms just went off all across Europe. There was this real fear that Trump might, go rogue, maybe pressure Zelensky into a terrible deal, demand territory be given up. And the reaction was dramatic. European leaders literally dropped their vacations, flew to Washington on barely a day's notice. They treated it like a diplomatic emergency.
Wow. European leaders just showing up like that, basically crashing the party on such short notice. That sounds completely unprecedented in diplomacy.
It really was highly unusual. Normally, these high-level visits are planned meticulously weeks, months in advance. This time, the Europeans treated it like a fire drill. Total urgency. Rushing to D.C. and, metaphorically, and maybe even sometimes literally, barging into the room. And the key reason for this extraordinary step, it was about who was in the room with the former president. Meaning he wasn't always just surrounded by his official government advisors, the career diplomats. His inner circle often included political allies, business associates, people like J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, Howard Lutnick, Marco Rubio, Scott Bent, folks who weren't necessarily seasoned foreign policy experts. So the fear was, without strong diplomatic backup, Zelensky could have been left incredibly vulnerable, facing a potential diplomatic disaster.
So Europe's strategy was basically to make sure Zelensky wasn't left alone in that room.
That was precisely the goal. They made sure Zelensky wasn't isolated. They kind of orchestrated things, forced the necessary photo ops to project unity. They demanded seats at the table in the key meetings. They even apparently created another room that you have to walk through, basically setting up layers of diplomatic buffer. In essence, they boxed Trump in, kept the situation within more traditional diplomatic channels and structures.
Okay, that's already pretty extraordinary. But then, during this incredibly sensitive meeting, the former president actually took a call from Vladimir Putin.
That is what was reported, yes. During this crucial meeting with Zelensky, the leader whose country was actively being invaded by Russia, the former president reportedly literally took a call from Vladimir Putin. I mean, among diplomatic professionals, that was seen as just stunning. A major breach of protocol, diplomatic malpractice, some called it, caused huge concern among allies.
Unbelievable. And there was a hot mic moment, too.
Yes. On top of the Putin call, Trump was apparently caught on a sloppy hot mic, meaning the microphone wasn't properly turned off, telling French President Emmanuel Macron that Putin wants to make a deal. And he pitched it almost like, well, like a real estate transaction, according to reports. What's so striking here is just the perceived recklessness of these actions. Taking the Putin call risked signaling to allies that maybe he was buying Putin's narrative. And the hot mic thing, it just exposed his own supposed negotiating stance to everyone. It really raises a big question about international relations, you know? What does it mean when a major world leader acts in ways that seem so unpredictable, so unconventional in these incredibly high-stakes moments?
So despite all this drama, these potential disasters, Zelensky actually came out of it okay, maybe even stronger. It sounds like they dodged a bullet.
They absolutely dodged a bullet. That worst-case scenario, Zelensky getting cornered, humiliated, forced into giving up land, it was avoided. He actually left that meeting in a stronger position. And that was largely thanks to the Europeans stepping in, providing that critical cover and support. It really proved that old diplomatic saying, strength, especially unified strength among allies, begets leverage.
But Zelensky still needs American support, right?
Yeah.
So he still has to navigate that relationship.
Oh, absolutely. That's the ongoing reality. Ukraine desperately needs continued American support weapons, aid, diplomatic muscle. So Zelensky is forced to navigate the complexities of U.S. politics. Even when the leadership seems unpredictable, it's often described as a devil's bargain. He has to rely on this powerful ally whose leader might operate outside the usual diplomatic playbook, forcing him to constantly manage those domestic political wins in the U.S. while his country is fighting for survival.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the U.S. is usually seen as the broker in these situations.
Traditionally, yes. The U.S. is supposed to be the heavyweight, applying pressure, building consensus, acting as the impartial broker. But in this instance, the former president's approach was described by some observers as just winging it, improvisational. And that made him seem, in the eyes of the Europeans at least, potentially susceptible to manipulation, especially by someone like Putin, who was reportedly dazzling the idea of a deal, maybe even hinting at a Nobel Peace Prize. So Europe saw Trump as a potential weak link in that moment. And they intervened decisively to make sure Ukraine didn't end up paying the price for that unconventional approach.
So Europe essentially acted as the stabilizing force here.
In a very real sense, yes. They provided that crucial diplomatic backstop for Zelensky, made sure Ukraine's position wasn't fumbled away, ensured Putin didn't walk away with a cheap diplomatic win from that specific meeting. Of course, the war grinds on. Ukraine's dependence on U.S. aid is still a reality. But in that particular incident, Europe's intervention definitely tipped the balance of strength in Zelensky's favor. You could almost say Europe bailed out Zelensky diplomatically, ensuring Ukraine's stance wasn't compromised.
All right. Now, for a story that, honestly, if you read it in a spy novel, you might think it's a bit over the top, but it actually happened. Picture this: a super high-stakes, highly secret diplomatic summit between the U.S. president and the president of Russia. Now, picture sensitive government documents from that exact summit, just left behind in a public hotel printer.
Yeah.
Seriously.
It is truly astonishing, but yes, it happened. Anchorage, Alaska. August 2018, this was the setting for a major summit between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. High stakes, lots of attention, and the discovery. It was made by 3 completely ordinary guests staying at the Captain Cook Hotel. It's a nice 4-star hotel not far from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, where some meetings were happening. These guests just walked into the hotel's public business center, and there they were. 8 pages of sensitive government documents. Clear U.S. State Department markings, just sitting in the printer tray.
A public business center printer. No clearance needed, no badge swipe, just there. That's not exactly sophisticated spycraft needed to find that. How on earth does that happen at that level?
It boggles the mind. And these weren't just like lunch menus, despite what was later claimed. These documents had critical details.
Right.
Exact meeting times, locations on a military base, phone numbers of American officials involved, a detailed seating chart for a luncheon, even what ceremonial gift Trump was planning to give Putin. Yeah. Pages 2 through 5 apparently had contact info for U.S. staff, a list of 13 American and Russian officials, even phonetic guides for the Russian names useful for intelligence, potentially. Pages 6 and 7 detailed the luncheon. And get this, the document explicitly said the lunch was in honor of His Excellency Vladimir Putin. The seating chart showed Trump and Putin facing each other, Trump flanked by 6 specific American officials. Details that have diplomatic meaning.
In honor of His Excellency Vladimir Putin. Given everything that's happened since, that phrase alone is jarring. But leaving documents with names, numbers, locations on a base in a public printer.
Exactly. And what's almost as remarkable was the official response afterwards. When asked about it, the White House reportedly just downplayed it. One spokesperson apparently brushed it off, calling the documents nothing more than a multi-page lunch menu.
A lunch menu with seating charts, contact info, and locations on a military base.
Precisely. And calling it just a lunch menu is frankly absurd. It raises a really important question. This wasn't just some harmless oopsie. Leaving documents like that exposed could genuinely put people's safety at risk. It provides potential adversaries with critical intelligence who's involved, their phone numbers, where they'll be inside a U.S. military installation. And yes, that detail about the lunch being explicitly in honor of His Excellency Vladimir Putin, a leader now widely condemned for invading Ukraine, targeting civilians, accused of war crimes, that just adds another deeply troubling layer to the whole incident.
And you're saying this wasn't just a one-off crazy mistake, it fit a pattern.
Unfortunately, yes, it wasn't an isolated incident. This printer thing seemed to fit into a broader pattern of, well, carelessness, lapses in basic security protocols that were reported during that administration. I mean, there were other examples, reports of U.S. law enforcement accidentally adding some random person to a private group chat about an active manhunt, or national security officials mistakenly including a journalist in a chat where they were discussing military strikes in Yemen.
Just basic operational security errors.
Right. And what was really striking and concerning to many observers was the apparent lack of consequences. Time after time, with these kinds of lapses, there seemed to be no real consequences. Nobody reportedly lost their job over the printer incident. No one was really held accountable publicly. The unofficial explanation often seemed to be just, don't worry about it.
So if we connect that to the bigger picture, what does that pattern suggest?
It suggests potentially a dangerous culture of carelessness when handling sensitive information, especially within certain parts of the government at that time. And the double standard becomes really stark when you compare it to, say, the years and years of intense focus and investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. It just raises this fundamental question: how can there be such a massive disconnect between the potential severity of leaving classified or sensitive info in a hotel printer and the apparent lack of any serious accountability?
So what's the takeaway for us, the listeners? It sounds like security isn't just about fancy spy gadgets and firewalls. The human element is huge.
Absolutely huge. Security, ultimately, isn't just about high-tech defenses. Human error, negligence, carelessness, those are often the critical weak links in any security system. This incident in Alaska, the printer predicament, while maybe minor on its own, it almost feels symbolic, doesn't it? Like a perfect little metaphor for a broader lack of control, maybe a lack of clear boundaries, and certainly a lack of accountability in aspects of the U.S.-Russia relationship during that specific period. It points to a breakdown in just basic fundamental security practices, things you'd expect even a teenager to know better than don't leave your important stuff lying around in a public place, especially when your stuff involves national security details.
Okay, we've been talking quite a bit about how accountability can sometimes pop up in unexpected places, and how challenges to the way things are normally done play out in different arenas, courts, diplomacy, even hotel business centers. Now, let's dig into another really critical legal fight, one that also touches on this theme of government functions potentially being used as leverage. Specifically, this involves funds that are supposed to help crime victims. This is the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA lawsuit.
Yeah, this is a hugely important story, and one that often flies under the radar but has massive implications. So the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, goes way back to 1982, signed into law during the Reagan administration, and its purpose was incredibly straightforward, humane, and pretty much universally supported at the time. It was designed to provide vital support for crime victims all across the country.
What kind of support are we talking about?
We're talking about funds to help cover things like lost wages if someone can't work after a crime, medical bills, counseling services, funeral assistance if the worst happens, even forensic exams like rape kits. The whole idea was to make sure victims weren't just forgotten after a crime happened, to address what Congress back then called a national disgrace, the fact that victims often had little support to rebuild their lives.
Okay, so a really essential bipartisan program aimed at helping vulnerable people. How did that become a political football book?
Well, unfortunately, it did. The administration at the time, the Trump administration, tried to tie these VOCA funds to its immigration policies. Basically, the idea was to try and punish so-called sanctuary cities, or states that leaned Democratic politically. They tried to make getting these crucial VOCA grants conditional on those states or cities complying with certain federal immigration enforcement demands.
But wait, was that connection to immigration policy ever part of the original VOCA law?
Absolutely not. That's the key point.
Oh.
The administration's action directly contradicted the original intent and the actual text of the VOCA law. There's nothing in VOCA that links victim support funds to immigration enforcement or state-local policies on immigration. So in response, a big coalition, 23 states plus the District of Columbia, filed a lawsuit. They filed it in Rhode Island. And their argument was that the administration's actions were unconstitutional.
On what grounds?
Several grounds. They argued it violated the spending clause of the Constitution, which limits how Congress can attach conditions to federal funds given to states. They argued it violated the Administrative Procedure Act, which dictates how federal agencies have to follow established, fair procedures when they make rules. And they argued it violated the fundamental principle of separation of powers, basically saying the executive branch was overstepping its authority and trying to legislate through funding conditions, which is Congress's job. The states put it very powerfully. They said that by withholding these funds meant for healing, meant for dignity, the administration was essentially victimizing the victims all over again.
That's a strong claim. It sounds like a major legal showdown, and a really critical one for the people who rely on those VOCA funds. How effective have these kinds of lawsuits challenging executive actions actually been?
Remarkably effective, actually. And it really speaks to the persistence of state attorneys general and various legal groups. If you look at the data, the Trump administration's executive orders overall had a pretty tough time in court, something like a 27% success rate, meaning around 110 orders were blocked by courts, another 90 were tied up in litigation, out of about 274 issued. That shows the judiciary acting as a real check.
So the courts pushed back significantly.
They did. And certain places, courts in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maryland, D.C., California, Washington State, they consistently ruled against these kinds of executive actions across a range of issues. What's also really interesting is that sometimes just the threat of a lawsuit or simply filing the lawsuit was enough. Like, there were cases involving education funds where just filing the suit put enough pressure on the administration that they backed down before a judge even ruled. Overall, state attorneys general reported winning something like 90% of these kinds of challenges in the lower courts, a very high success rate.
Okay, so connecting this VOCA lawsuit back to our larger theme today.
Right. If we connect this VOCA case to the broader picture, these lawsuits are just vital. They serve as a crucial break. They slow down potentially harmful policies. They actively protect vulnerable communities, in this case, crime victims, from losing essential support. And they really hold the line when maybe other checks and balances, like Congress, are gridlocked or not acting effectively. It's a powerful reminder for everyone listening. The defense of democracy, the upholding of the rule of law, it doesn't just happen in D.C., it doesn't just happen in the Supreme Court. It's fought and often won in state capitals, in these lower federal courtrooms, by dedicated legal teams across the country. They are a fundamental mechanism for keeping executive power within its constitutional bounds.
Okay, so after diving deep into these really diverse stories, from Florida swamps to Alaskan predators, to courtrooms to diplomatic meetings, a pretty clear pattern starts to come into focus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We've seen these moments where power was challenged, sometimes exposed and sometimes incredibly held accountable, often in ways that just weren't obvious or weren't widely reported.
Yeah, what's really illuminating, I think, is that consistent thread running through everything we've discussed. Whether it's the ACLU using legal pressure to force a change at Alligator Alcatraz, or Congresswoman MacGyver's really tenacious fight against what she sees as selective prosecution, or Europe stepping in quite dramatically to protect Ukraine's diplomatic position, or even the light shed on carelessness by that printer predicament and the huge pushback in the VOCA lawsuit. These are all examples of just persistent pushback.
From different angles, but the same underlying dynamic.
Exactly. These actions, often happening way outside the daily media glare, they function like essential safeguards for a democratic system. They work to keep the processes honest, keep power accountable. They really are, in a way, the unseen defenders, the first responders, upholding those foundational principles.
And it definitely makes you second guess those initial headlines we often see, right?
It absolutely should, and it raises that important question for you, the listener. How often do the mainstream media narratives, just by nature of needing to be quick and concise, end up missing the real impact? Or the deeper significance of what happened? We saw it clearly with Alligator Alcatraz. The headlines totally obscured a major win. We saw it with the downplaying of serious security lapses. It just highlights again and again why it's so critical for all of us to dig a little deeper, get beyond the surface level of a headline or a short news summary.
We also kept seeing this theme of government functions themselves being challenged. questions about impartiality or being used for political leverage.
Yes, that came up repeatedly. Both the MacGyver case with the justice system and the VOCA lawsuit involving victim funds, they really spotlight that concerning trend. The potential for government functions to be perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being used for political advantage. And that's why challenges like the VOCA lawsuit are so crucial. You had 23 states and D.C. pushing back hard against an administration trying to link victim support funds, something universally agreed upon, to a completely arguing successfully that it violated fundamental constitutional principles, the spending clause, administrative fairness, separation of powers. They protected vital support for vulnerable people by holding the line legally.
So bringing it all together, what's the big takeaway message from all these interconnected stories, from judges pushing back to allies intervening to even just the stark reality of sensitive documents left in a printer?
Well, what emerges is this really complex picture, right? A period marked by intense scrutiny, frequent legal challenges against executive power, and the willingness in some cases to seemingly disregard basic security protocols or to try and leverage funds meant for crime victims for political goals. It really highlights the significant risks when that kind of carelessness or maybe political calculation intersects with real governmental power. But here's the other side of it, and this is crucial. While the constant fighting, the endless legal battles, the need for vigilance, while that can be exhausting for everyone involved, these challenges are working. They are having an effect.
How so?
They demonstrably block policies that could cause harm. They force the release of needed funds, like with the OCA. They prevent unchecked power grabs. Every single win, even if it's partial, even if it's won on procedural grounds like initially with Alligator Alcatraz, it reinforces the fundamental idea that the Constitution's still operating. It's still doing its job as a check. And it shows that democracy still has its defenders working tirelessly, often quietly, in courtrooms, in state capitals, sometimes even through international pressure. These are the unseen battles, the quiet victories that ultimately keep the system accountable. Hashtag outro.
All right, folks, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From Florida swamps to Alaskan hotel printers, from contentious courtrooms right here at home to high-stakes international summits. What we've tried to uncover are those real stories, the battles often fought out of sight, and the quiet, sometimes unexpected victories that push back against overreach and challenge those easy, often misleading narratives. And the core message, I think, is pretty powerful. Justice isn't just some grand declaration you hear on TV or read about from the Supreme Court. It happens in the trenches. It happens in those lower courts, through overlooked lawsuits, and really through the persistent, often thankless efforts of people and organizations who just refuse to give up. So here's my challenge to you as you go about your week. Don't just glance at the headlines. Ask yourself, okay, but what's really going on here? Make that effort to follow the story beyond just the surface. And definitely remember this when someone tells you, oh, that case was dismissed, or tries to wave something away as just a technicality. Maybe pause, dig a little deeper. Because the full truth, the real impact, might look a whole lot different than what you first heard. What other unreported victories or maybe hidden vulnerabilities are out there right now that we're all collectively missing? Stay curious, stay sharp, and stay critical.